Most people who lose their hearing don't go deaf all at once. They just quietly disappear from their own lives, stopping going to restaurants, nodding along to conversations they can't follow, pulling back from family dinners because the noise is too much and the embarrassment is worse. And they do it so gradually, neither they nor the people around them notice until years have gone by. That's what makes this topic one of the most important ones I cover, and one of the most ignored. I'm Dr. Nathan Wells, a board-certified internal medicine physician with over 20 years of clinical practice focused specifically on patients over 50. I've managed hearing-related cases from inside the exam room, not just the audiological side, but what happens to the rest of the body and the brain when hearing loss goes unaddressed. This is not the topic most doctors bring up at your annual visit, which is exactly why I'm bringing it up here. Here's the number that stops most of my patients cold. According to the National Institute on Deafness and Other Communication Disorders, roughly 2 out of every 3 adults over the age of 70 have measurable hearing loss, yet fewer than 1 in 5 of them have ever used a hearing aid or sought treatment. Read that again. Most people walking around right now with significant hearing loss have never done a single thing about it. Not because they can't, but because they've told themselves it isn't serious enough, or it's just part of getting older, or they'll deal with it later. What I'm going to show you today is why later carries a price tag most people never see coming. I'll walk you through the real biology of why hearing declines after 65, what's actually happening inside the ear and the brain when it does, and, most importantly, the downstream health consequences that have nothing to do with sound. Some of these will genuinely surprise you. One of those surprises is this. The relationship between untreated hearing loss and dementia is so well documented now that Johns Hopkins researchers have called it the single largest modifiable risk factor for cognitive decline in older adults. Larger than smoking, larger than high blood pressure. Sit with that for a moment. I'll explain exactly why later in this video. Before I ask anything of you, if this video finds someone who needed it, share it with one person in your life over 60 who keeps saying, "I hear just fine." That one share might matter more than you know. And before we go any further, everything I share here is education. It is not a diagnosis, and it is not a substitute for sitting down with your own physician who knows your full history in ways no video ever can. What I can do is make sure you walk away informed enough to have a better conversation with that doctor. Let's start with what's actually happening inside the ear. Most people picture hearing loss as a volume problem, like someone slowly turning down a dial. But that's not quite right. Age-related hearing loss, which doctors call presbycusis, is more like a frequency problem. Think of it like a piano, with certain keys going silent while others still play fine. What goes first, almost universally, are the high-frequency sounds, the consonants in speech, the sibilants in words like fish or six or this. The low-frequency vowels tend to hold on longer, so what happens is that speech starts to sound muffled rather than quiet. You hear someone talking, you just can't make out what they said, and that is a profoundly different problem than simply needing more volume. Inside the cochlea, the snail-shaped organ deep inside your ear, sit tiny hair cells that convert sound vibrations into electrical signals your brain can read. You're born with roughly 15,000 of them, and unlike cells in other parts of the body, they do not regenerate. Once they're gone, they're gone. After decades of noise exposure, the natural vascular changes of aging, and cumulative inflammation, those hair cells begin to die off, starting with the ones tuned to high frequencies. This is not a dramatic event. It happens over years, which is part of why so few people catch it early. My patient Gerald, 71, came to see me about fatigue. He was exhausted by 3 in the afternoon every day and couldn't figure out why. His sleep was fine. His blood work looked reasonable. When I asked him about social activities, he mentioned he'd stopped going to his weekly poker game 8 months earlier. When I pressed him, he said the room was just too loud, too hard to follow. His wife had been telling him for 2 years that he needed his hearing checked. He'd been waving her off. When we finally ran a formal hearing evaluation, Gerald had moderate to severe high-frequency loss in both ears. But the fatigue, that's what I want to focus on for a moment, because Gerald's fatigue wasn't coming from his ears. It was coming from his brain. When the auditory signal that reaches your brain is degraded, incomplete, missing pieces, your brain compensates by working harder. Cognitive neuroscientists call this listening effort, and the research behind it is striking. A 2017 study published in Ear and Hearing found that people with untreated hearing loss devote significantly more cognitive resources to simply decoding speech, leaving fewer resources for memory, processing, and executive function. It's the mental equivalent of trying to read a water-damaged book. You can piece together most of the words, but it costs you considerably more energy than reading a clean page. Gerald's brain was running a heavy load every single day just to get through conversations, and by afternoon, it was drained. 6 months after he got hearing aids fitted, he came back and told me his energy had returned to a level he hadn't felt in years. Not because his hearing was perfect now, it wasn't, but because his brain was no longer fighting so hard for every word. Now, the dementia connection. This is the one I promised you, and I don't want to bury it or soften it, because the data does not give us permission to be vague about it. In 2011, researchers at Johns Hopkins University, led by Dr. Frank Lin, published what became one of the most cited studies in geriatric medicine. They followed nearly 2,000 adults over a decade and found that individuals with mild hearing loss were twice as likely to develop dementia compared to those with normal hearing. Those with moderate loss were 3 times as likely. Severe hearing loss pushed that risk to 5 times higher. 5 times. The researchers proposed several mechanisms: the cognitive load I just described, the atrophy of auditory cortex areas from sensory deprivation, and perhaps most importantly, social isolation. When people stop engaging in conversation because it's too exhausting or too embarrassing, the brain loses critical stimulation, and a brain that is understimulated begins to shrink. Literally, reduced gray matter volume has been documented in imaging studies of adults with long-term untreated hearing loss. This is why the Lancet Commission on Dementia Prevention now lists hearing loss as the most impactful modifiable risk factor across the entire lifespan. Not the most impactful for 65-year-olds specifically, across the entire lifespan. Addressing hearing loss in midlife and beyond has a larger projected impact on dementia prevention than any single pharmaceutical intervention currently available. That's not a fringe opinion. That's the scientific consensus. My patient Dorothy, 68, understood this better than most. She came to me proactively after reading about the dementia link. Her hearing loss was mild. She wasn't struggling dramatically, but she'd noticed she was asking people to repeat themselves more often, and she'd started sitting closer to the television. She got fitted with hearing aids within 2 months of that appointment. "I wasn't going to gamble with my brain," she told me. I've thought about that sentence a lot since she said it. It's exactly the right framing. There's another risk I want to cover that gets almost no attention: the connection between untreated hearing loss and fall risk. This one surprises people every time I bring it up in the exam room. Your sense of balance depends on 2 systems working in concert: the vestibular system in your inner ear and your brain's constant background processing of spatial and environmental cues. When hearing is impaired, that environmental awareness narrows. You stop picking up on subtle audio cues that orient you in space: footsteps behind you, the sound of traffic, the ambient noise that tells your brain where you are in a room. A study published in JAMA Otolaryngology, Head and Neck Surgery, found that adults with even mild hearing loss were nearly 3 times more likely to report a history of falling compared to those with normal hearing. For every 10 decibels of hearing loss, fall risk increased by 1.4 times. Falls are the leading cause of fatal injury in adults over 65. This is not a small footnote. It is a direct, measurable consequence of letting hearing loss go unmanaged. Hearing loss also reshapes the cardiovascular picture in ways that are still being mapped by researchers. The blood supply to the cochlea comes from the same vascular network that supplies the heart and brain. It's a tiny, delicate system with no redundancy. Conditions that damage small blood vessels, diabetes, high blood pressure, elevated cholesterol, consistently accelerate cochlear damage. The relationship runs in both directions, too. Some researchers now believe that cochlear health may serve as an early warning indicator of cardiovascular disease, because the cochlea shows vascular damage earlier than most other tissues. Your ear, in a real sense, may be the canary in the coal mine for your circulatory system. I want to talk about something that doesn't show up in medical journals, but shows up in every conversation I have with patients about hearing loss: the shame. There is a social stigma attached to hearing aids that has no rational basis, but exerts enormous real-world force. People who wouldn't hesitate to wear glasses refuse hearing aids for years, sometimes decades, because they associate them with being old, with being diminished. They would rather nod and smile through a conversation they can't follow than be seen putting something in their ear. I've had patients tell me they faked their way through family holiday dinners for 5 or 6 years rather than admit they needed help. Think about what that costs, not just cognitively, but emotionally. The isolation, the exhaustion of performing comprehension you don't have. Modern hearing technology has changed almost beyond recognition in the last decade. Today's devices are small enough to sit completely inside the ear canal, invisible to anyone looking at you. Many connect via Bluetooth directly to phones, stream audio from televisions, and adjust automatically to different acoustic environments. Some of the most sophisticated ones now integrate fall detection and can alert emergency contacts if the wearer goes down. The stigma attached to hearing aids belongs to a device from 30 years ago that no longer exists. What exists now is a precision instrument that protects both your hearing and your cognitive function. My patient Raymond, 74, resisted hearing aids for 6 years. His wife Margaret had been gently raising it since he turned 68, and every year he found a reason to postpone. He finally came to see me after his youngest grandchild, who was 6 years old, stopped trying to talk to him at family gatherings because Raymond kept asking her to repeat herself, and she got frustrated and gave up. That was the thing that broke through. Not the fatigue, not the missed conversations, his granddaughter giving up on talking to him. He came into my office the following Monday and asked me to refer him to an audiologist. He was fitted within 3 weeks, and the first thing he told me afterward was that he could hear Margaret's voice clearly across the kitchen again. Not loudly, just clearly, for the first time in years. So what should you actually do with all of this? First, if you are 65 or older and you have not had a formal audiological evaluation in the last 2 years, schedule one. Not a self-test app, not the volume on your television as a proxy, a real evaluation with a licensed audiologist. The American Academy of Audiology recommends baseline hearing screening starting at 50 and formal evaluations every 3 years after 60, or sooner if there's any change. If you've been dismissing your spouse or your kids when they tell you they have to repeat themselves, they're not wrong, and they're not nagging. They're seeing something you may not want to see. Second, manage the conditions that accelerate cochlear damage. Uncontrolled blood pressure, elevated blood sugar, and high cholesterol all degrade the small vessels that feed the cochlea. Protecting your cardiovascular system is protecting your hearing. This is not a metaphor. It's the same blood supply. Third, protect what hearing you still have. Noise-induced damage compounds on top of age-related damage. At concerts, sporting events, power tools, use protection. The damage from a single very loud exposure can be permanent within minutes. And fourth, if you've been told you have hearing loss and you've been putting off treatment, I want you to think about Raymond's granddaughter. Think about what 6 years of delay costs. Not in decibels, but in conversations you half heard, relationships you slowly drifted from, and a brain that was working twice as hard every day just to keep up. The return on addressing this early is enormous. The cost of waiting is not just inconvenience. The research is clear on that. I know this video covers a topic many people find uncomfortable, but the discomfort of acknowledging it is a fraction of what untreated hearing loss actually takes from you over time. You didn't click on this video by accident. Something brought you here, maybe something you've been noticing or someone you're worried about. Trust that instinct. I'm Dr. Nathan Wells. Stay aware, stay proactive, and take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.